The sun hit the tarmac like a hammer. Heat shimmered across the open yard of the coastal forward operating base, bending the air above scattered pallets and half-coiled hoses. Farther out, under the stretched shadow of a faded comms shack, Dana bent at the waist and hauled another sandbag into place. Her gloves were chalked with dust, the knees of her fatigues damp from sweat and contact with the ground. She adjusted the line of bags with her boot and reached for the clipboard, resting on a dented crate nearby. She logged the angle in pencil, checked the slant of the runoff trench she had dug by hand, and turned to drag another bag across the gravel. Her back moved in rhythm, steady and unhurried, like someone counting heartbeats in silence. Near the tents, a cluster of personnel leaned in loose formation under the shade. One held a bottle of sports drink against his neck, while another balanced on the edge of a cargo sled, eyes flicking toward Dana without real interest. "She's back at it again," someone muttered, half laughing. "Sandbag Nostradamus." Another voice answered from a folding chair. "Think she's expecting Poseidon to roll through here, forecasts dry all week." There was laughter. Not mean exactly, but dismissive. Easy. The kind of chuckling that stayed warm because no one believed they'd done anything cruel. Dana shifted another tarp into place across the top layer of her berm. It was one of the old issue tarps, patched and sun-faded, cut to form a corner barrier that hugged the rear junction of the comms building. She anchored it with gravel and a few extra bags, measuring the runoff line with a length of tied twine. Her pencil notations moved quickly. She didn't pause. "Careful," came another voice, this time from a passing maintenance tech carrying a toolkit. "You're going to strain yourself for a puddle." He grinned and kept walking. She didn't look up. A junior crewman from the support base stopped at the edge of the path, watching her for a few seconds. His hand hovered over the radio at his belt. She didn't meet his eyes, and he didn't speak. After a moment, he turned and walked off without a word. The base moved on around her. A loudspeaker crackled with dispatch updates. Far off, someone revved an ATV engine and took a turn too fast around a generator shack. Laughter flared and faded again. Dana wiped her arm across her forehead, leaving a streak of dust along her temple. Her clipboard pages fluttered in the breeze but stayed anchored by a clipped pen and a strip of duct tape. She stepped back from the trench, narrowing her eyes against the glare, and checked the angle again. The slope curved gently away from the shack, directing water toward the outer ditch near the generator compound. It wasn't perfect, but it would hold for light flooding. She knew it wouldn't stay light. No one had updated the runoff forecast after the last terrain shift. 2 weeks ago, she had found a collapsed drainage intake during a low sweep along the outer pad. When she mentioned it, a second lieutenant told her to file it through building maintenance. She did. Nothing happened. Now she carried her own sketch of the elevation. It was folded into the back of her clipboard, marked in pencil with water arrows and bag placements. She had adjusted her trench line 3 times since morning, watching how the gravel shifted under weight, how the water pooled after Jose tests. The others didn't notice. They didn't ask. Dana pulled another sandbag from the stack, this one labeled in black marker with her initials. She set it down at the trench's edge, lined it against the others, and pressed her palm flat to check for gaps. The heat off the surface bit through the fabric of her glove. But she didn't flinch. Behind her, 2 transport officers shouted across the yard. One was pointing at a pallet of signal repeaters. The other glanced over Dana's direction and shook his head. "She building an ark or something. Let her..." The first one said, "Better out there than messing with our loadout." Dana finished setting the last bag of the section. She brushed dirt off her knee and stood slowly, her spine stiff from crouching. The sun was starting to move westward, casting long streaks of shadow beneath the shack. She walked to the end of the berm and squatted again, checking the slight dip where 2 lines met. A single drop of condensation from the tarp edge fell and landed near her boot, vanishing instantly into the dirt. Her face stayed calm, eyes scanning without urgency. She noted the shift and scribbled a line on her chart. The motion was automatic. A pair of officers passed by without acknowledging her. One flicked a bottle cap into the gravel as he walked. The other waved it off. "She's logistics. right? Unofficial morale project. More laughter, then footsteps fading. Dana reached for another length of rope and began measuring her crossline again. Her movements were smooth, quiet, almost practiced. Her mouth stayed closed, her jaw relaxed. No one noticed the way her hands moved with care, or how her notes ran across the page like a mechanic's hymn. She wasn't doing this for them. She knew where the breech line sat, and she knew what would come through it. The base was quiet after dark. A few windows glowed with blue light where off-duty crew watched old action films on personal projectors. Somewhere near the admin hut, laughter echoed in short bursts from a poker game. The scent of reheated chili drifted under the humid breeze. No one had noticed the wind change yet. Behind the comm shack, away from the last of the security lights, Dana worked by headlamp. Her boots were set aside near a bucket of chalk lines. She moved barefoot along the trench, feeling the slope with the soles of her feet the way some people feel music. Each step was deliberate. She laid another tarp section across the compacted earth and pinned it down with 2 smooth stones scavenged earlier from the drainage ditch. The beam of her headlamp caught specks of dust rising with every bag she adjusted. Her hands moved automatically, pressing, testing, rotating each layer until it locked with the one beneath. The bags were older ones, stitched and restitched, some half-faded from years in storage. It didn't matter. They held. Dana paused and pulled a folded printout from the side pouch on her belt. It was the elevation sheet no one else used, a copy of the last terrain scan from before the last pad extension. Her own annotations ran along the borders in pencil, a downward slope she had mapped out 3 nights ago in the rain, drain line angles, seepage pockets, clay soil shear points. She crouched near the left corner and scratched a chalk mark onto a stick she had notched for slope checking. The angle was still correct. A voice drifted from the main path as someone stepped outside for a smoke, a flick of a lighter, then footsteps crunching the gravel. Dana stayed low, tucking the sheet into her jacket. A maintenance tech passed without pausing, glancing toward her headlamp. He said, "You know that's not even your assignment." "Right." His tone was more amused than harsh. "You're not on the shelter list." Dana didn't answer. She brushed a line of dirt back into place with her palm and smoothed the tarp with a tug. The man took another drag and walked off. The trench looped around the base of the comms unit, not just diverting water, but shaping it. She had studied how the slope fed into the defunct access culvert. The old drains were still partially functional, if redirected. Nobody used them because nobody remembered where they went. But Dana had mapped it herself after her first week at the post. She had done the same thing before, at a different station one without proper grading. That time, the housing wing flooded before the forecast even called it. The power went first, then comms. Dana led the evac herself using a dry corridor she had built 2 weeks earlier. During downtime, the report was buried under admin logs. Her drainage cert was denied on procedural grounds. Twice. They said she didn't follow the submission channel. She never reapplied. Now, she worked alone, barefoot in gravel, pushing old canvas into a storm barrier no one had ordered. The wind picked up. It stirred the dust pile near the chalk line, sent a fine layer of grit across her ankles and over the trench. Dana wiped the sweat from her brow and pushed the rock anchors tighter into the edges of the tarp. Her hands were nicked and bruised from earlier bags, her arms dusted pale with powdered stone. She walked back along the edge of the trench and made another slope mark, then stood and watched it from a different angle. Her headlamp flicked once as the battery dipped, then steadied. She didn't blink. She reached for another chalked stone and reinforced the edge of the runoff channel. Inside the barracks, a crew member turned up the volume on a movie, and a wave of canned laughter drifted out the cracked window. Dana heard it and adjusted the last sandbag without looking up. It locked perfectly into the row. She sat back for a moment, breath steady, heart rate low. Her boots waited at the edge of the trench. She picked them up but did not put them on yet. Instead, she walked the trench line once more, stepping over the bags in silence, watching how the fabric caught the wind and settled again. A quiet rhythm. She remembered her first storm drill at 12 years old. Her uncle had shown her how to loop tarp corners into knots that held under pressure. He said water didn't care who you were. It only obeyed gravity. She had never forgotten. One final bag waited near the bucket. Dana picked it up, rotated it slowly in her hands, then bent to place it at the corner of the trench curve. She pressed it down, marked it, sat back. No one saw her work. No one stood nearby. And that, she had learned, was the only way it ever lasted. She switched off her headlamp and let the dark return. The morning air smelled like copper and ozone. The wind had changed again, carrying with it the heavy tension of a storm still holding its breath. At the far end of the base, the operations tent flapped open as staff and officers filtered in, voices clipped and caffeine sharpened. A new weather advisory was already posted on the internal feed. Rain was no longer possible. It was imminent. Dana approached the tent from the south slope, her clipboard tucked under one arm, a laminated map curled tight in one hand. She wore the same sun-worn fatigues as the day before. Her boots left thin prints in the damp grit along the concrete. A knot of senior personnel stood inside, gathered around a portable table stacked with screens and satellite readouts. The screen glowed with topography, wind overlays, and runoff projections. She waited outside the opening for a moment, not stepping in, listening. One officer was pointing to a highlighted flood basin near the drone hangars. Another argued about runway drainage redundancy. Nobody had mentioned the comms trailer. Dana stepped forward and cleared her throat softly. No one turned. She tried again, louder this time. She said, "Excuse me, there's a runoff low beneath the uplink shelter. It's not listed in the main scan, but it's exposed. I mapped it manually." A tall officer in mirrored glasses glanced over with a mild frown. His tone didn't rise. He replied, "We've got engineers for that. You're not with base drainage." Dana unfolded her map anyway and pointed. The terrain under the far edge slopes 6 degrees toward the southwest culvert. It bypasses the old drain entirely. If the rain tracks west, the shelter floods. An admin officer seated on a folding crate near the front gave a short laugh. It was Valerie, the one who always carried the base tablet and rarely looked up from it. She said, "Support crew, please wait outside briefing zones. This isn't a logistics sink." Dana hesitated. Her finger remained on the map. The line she had drawn cut through a shaded portion of the base where runoff estimates were listed as negligible. She had been there yesterday. She had seen the pooling start after just 5 minutes of hose testing. A pilot in a clean vest leaned against the frame of the tent, watching. He sipped from a tall metal thermos and spoke with the kind of ease that only came from knowing no one would ever question him. He asked, "You bagging your quarters too, or just starting a new obstacle course?" The laughter was louder this time. Several heads turned toward Dana, none of them sympathetic. She nodded once, quietly folded her map back into thirds, and slipped it under her arm. The checklist in her hand was already damp from her grip. She looked toward the empty chair near the edge of the table. No one offered it. As she stepped backward out of the tent, a younger staffer near the edge glanced her way. He opened his mouth like he might say something, but the moment passed. She turned before it could land. Outside, the wind picked up again. The clouds were rolling thick over the hills to the east. She walked back down the gravel path without speaking and crossed the field toward the comms shelter. The sandbag wall she had built stood unchanged. A faint wind had shifted the tarp edge on the south corner, flapping it gently like a warning. Dana crouched to adjust it, pinning it with a half brick from a discarded pallet. Her gloves were still clipped to her belt. Unused. She worked with bare hands. She tightened the west anchor line and added a second bag to the low point. This one was marked in thick black ink with her initials, Diechter, from when she had first started the line and thought someone might care to know who built it. She pressed it into the earth until it settled flush against the edge of the trench. Around the far corner of the comms unit, a pair of crewmen walked past without slowing. One of them glanced over and said to the other, "She's still doing the bag thing." The other laughed, not cruelly, just dismissively. She must be prepping for a documentary. Dana heard them. She didn't flinch. She folded the tarp edge once, tucked the excess, and moved on. She reinforced the final trench line and checked the chalk marks she had left the night before. One had smudged slightly from dew. She corrected it and redrew the curve. Back inside the operations tent, the officers loaded their tablets and debated drone airspace conflicts. None of them spoke her name. On the tarmac, someone hosed down a vehicle. Inside the comms shack, the lights flickered as the first pressure dip rolled over the base. Dana sat near the trench, checked her measurements, and slid the map back into its sleeve. She wasn't invited to the table. That had never mattered. She anchored one more line, adjusted the sandbag slope, and waited. The storm broke before noon. It came with no warning crack, no dramatic sky split, just a low groan across the horizon as if the ocean exhaled, and then the rain slammed downward like it had always been falling. Within minutes, the gravel paths were gone. Water rushed through low channels, poured off tents, surged under vehicles. Tarps flapped uselessly in the wind. Everything not tied down began to move. In the command tent, the lights flickered, then held. An alarm buzzed from a console near the power hub, followed by a second, louder one from the operations deck. One of the base's main generators had dropped offline. The cause wasn't mechanical. It was drowning. Dana was already outside. Her shirt clung to her back, soaked to the spine. She moved with purpose along the trench she had built by hand, now half submerged. The runoff followed her slope perfectly, curving around the corner of the uplink trailer and into the old concrete culvert she had reopened. The water rose high, but the berm held. Around her, shouts cut through the rain. A container tipped over near the drone hangar, slamming into a wall of crates. Sparks leapt from a junction panel, and a tech scrambled for cover. The drainage around the fuel depot collapsed in a wave of red mud. Cables floated like seaweed in a rip current. The base was in full scramble now. Personnel ran with tarps, tools, stretchers, anything they could carry. Most of the walkways were under 6 inches of fast water. The new barriers snapped off their anchors within minutes. But Dana's trench still curved like a spine around the uplink unit. Not 1 inch of water had crossed her line. A soaked fire team stumbled past, one of them pointing. This uplink's still green. Another voice shouted over the wind, "It's Holding who built this." A tech ducked behind the comms shack, blinking through the water. He saw her then, Dana, waist deep, hauling one more bag across the line. Her face was streaked with grit and rain. Her gloves were gone. Her arms flexed with effort as she jammed the last anchor into place and shouted, "Anchor that corner!" The slope still dry underneath. They rushed forward, helping her brace the last stretch. A floating storage lid bounced off the berm and skidded away. Water coiled past the edge like it had been routed. Inside the comm shelter, the last backup relay flickered. One of the technicians radioed Central Command. Uplink status operational. Transmitting at 100.0%. Only dry zone left. At the far end of the field, the drone station collapsed into blackout. Static hissed through the intercoms, and still, her trench held. Word passed quickly, her barriers holding. Then again, only uplink still transmitting. 2 soaked crewmen stood back, panting. One stared across the trench at Dana. His voice was barely audible over the wind. "We laughed at her." The other replied, quieter still, "She's saving our gear." Neither of them moved. Dana did. She turned, adjusted the final tarp, and reinforced the center line with a 4th anchor she had tied the night before. The knot came loose easily. She redid it without looking up. A boot floated past the kind issued to tower crews. No one claimed it. Water pooled in channels Dana had cleared 3 nights earlier, winding in snake patterns around the comms box wrapped in clear plastic. Her initials, written in permanent marker, had bled slightly, but they were still visible. At the edge of the trench, someone dropped to their knees, trying to secure a relay box. The man shouted, "Where's the schematic?" Dana pulled the chart from her belt pouch. It was soaked, the paper soft and wrinkled, but the pencil held. She handed it over, tapped a corner, and pointed. "That slope breaks here. Route through the gravel line. Not the trench. No ceremony. No pause. The man nodded and scrambled off. Rain surged harder, then briefly softened. A lull. A kind of breath. The tarp flapped again, snapped against the anchor lines like a sail. The berm curved like it had been designed in concrete, but it was hers fabric, rock, and sweat. Inside the shelter, voices spoke faster now, calm, then curious. The power stabilized. The backup relay was active. Someone in ops asked, "What sector is that coming from?" Another answered, "Flood Perimeter Delta, Uplink Node 5. They're calling it Floodline 0. Above them, a drone caught a partial aerial scan before losing visibility. On infrared, the entire base shimmered in cold blue blur except for one dry triangle marked in orange glow. The trench? She didn't hear them say her name, but she didn't need to. Dana stayed at the edge of her wall, adjusting bags, moving with purpose. Her breath was slow, her motions precise. She hadn't looked up in hours. They had never listened to her voice. Now, the base ran on her silence. The rain peaked with a sound like static tearing through fabric. It pounded the base in heavy, endless sheets, turning the yards into floodways and the tarmac into a broken streambed. The last of the base barriers had failed an hour ago. Water filled every low slope and crevice. Anything not reinforced had vanished beneath the runoff. Except the trench. Inside the comms trailer, 3 soaked crew members huddled around a central console. The air smelled of wet rubber and static electricity. Cables looped across tables and spliced junctions, all of them routed through the one zone still dry enough to function. A captain pointed to the old elevation chart that had been taped beside the console. It was water-stained and soft at the corners, but the pencil lines were still legible. He said, "Run everything through the dry corridor. No reroutes. Relays active at 100.0%. A younger officer flipped through a systems checklist and read aloud, "Comms relay, floodline 0 still holding." Someone near the doorway, voice hoarse from shouting over the storm, asked the question out loud. Who authorized that build? The answer came without hesitation from one of the technicians. She did. No one corrected him. Outside, Dana moved through a knee-deep channel beside the comms wall, guiding a length of tarp back into place. Her hands worked without rush. She used a loose anchor line to re-secure a sagging corner, then crossed to the far edge of the trench, where she knelt and swept grit away from a drain she had cleared days ago. The runoff obeyed the path she had given it. Up in the operations tower, Valerie stood behind the captain at the main feed console. Her mouth was tight, silent. She didn't speak as the overhead camera toggled to thermal. The entire base flickered with varying shades of blue and purple, flooded zones, soaked ground, failed barricades. But there, cutting across the lower corner like a scar, glowed a narrow, bright line of heat where dry earth met moving power. The trench, Dana's trench. A slow realization swept the room. They watched her move barely a shadow against the feed, but her presence was unmistakable. Calm, focused, not triumphant, just working. Valerie stepped back. Inside the shelter, a technician adjusted a radio headset, pressing one hand over his ear. He called out, "We've got a stable patch through the southern wall." She rerouted the uplink bypass under her trench cover. Someone passed him another relay cable. Run it through floodline 0. A comms runner pinned the elevation map directly above the operations whiteboard. Below it, in dry ink, he scribbled, "Updated perimeter Dana Reyes contour." They didn't ask if it was official. The line held. At the edge of the trench, one of the field crew watched Dana hammer a final spike into the ground beside the uplink housing. The hammer was standard issue, metal and plastic, but it rang against the sodden ground like something ceremonial. She did not glance up as more personnel entered her corridor. They followed her lines like a guide rope in a snowstorm. She had built it to redirect water. Now it directed people. The tech team ran fiber lines beneath her tarp. A communications officer stepped over a sandbag marked with Dana's initials and reached for the radio handoff. Floodline 0 is now primary. No one questioned it. The surge came again. Rain beat harder, wind shifting from north to east. Dana's line flexed, but it did not break. A few small rivulets formed around the edges, quickly swallowed by the gravel slits she had packed along the side. Her bag wall was half sunk now. One of the original bags, faded and split at the seam, still showed her lettering through the grime. It held. From the tower feed, a second drone scan appeared in infrared. Once again, the base blurred in water bloom. Only the triangle near the comms trailer stayed visible. Dry, hot, alive. Back inside the command center, someone said quietly. She built this alone. The captain responded without looking away. She saved us all. No one replied. Dana looped one last anchor line and braced it against the comms frame. Her arms trembled slightly now, not from doubt, but exhaustion. She had not spoken in hours. Behind her, another line of personnel approached the trench. One of them paused, looked down at her bags, then back at her. The wind hit his jacket and flared it like a flag. He said nothing, just stepped carefully over the line and went to work. Dana remained kneeling, adjusting the corner seam with one hand, smoothing the fabric like someone folding a flag. The tarp snapped once, then settled again. They had ignored her when she warned them, laughed when she trained, dismissed every bag, every pencil mark, every line she sketched. Now they ran every signal through her hands, and she said nothing at all. The morning after the flood, the base looked like something exhumed from deep time. Mud layered over everything. Crates tilted half-submerged in silt. A crushed toolbox sat twisted under a rusted bike rack. The sun was out again, hot and wide across the sky. But it landed on a field that no longer reflected the base they knew. Dana moved quietly through it. Her boots left faint prints in the soft ground as she stepped along the edge of her trench, now slumped but still intact. The sandbags were swollen, their seams darkened from saturation. Some had slipped, others settled deeper into the ground. But the line still held its shape. It had never broken. She untied a tarp line near the comms frame, coiling the soaked cord carefully in one hand. The tarp was heavy and sour with storm water. She rolled it methodically, pressed out the excess liquid, and stacked it beside the generator shed in a neat square. Her gloves, newly washed, hung from a hook nearby to dry in the sun. As she stepped around the corner, a young private approached, holding something in both hands. He looked like he had been searching for her. The item was small, damp, and marked in fading black ink. He asked, "This was your first one, right?" Dana took it gently. The sandbag was bloated and caked in mud, but the letters were still faintly visible along the seam. "Doctor?" She nodded. He said, "It held the line." She didn't speak, just nodded again and tucked the bag under one arm. The private walked away without asking for thanks. Inside the comm shelter, someone had clipped her laminated elevation map above the new weather chart. It wasn't labeled formally, just pinned at an angle with two bent clips. A grease pencil mark looped around the uplink trench. It didn't say her name, but no one questioned who had drawn it. A post-op report sat on the desk near the entrance. Dry now, typed and stamped. One line under the summary listed her without rank or duty title. It read, "Unscheduled flood mitigation lead, Reyes, Dana." No fanfare, no citation, just entry. A logistics officer passed her in the corridor and slowed briefly. He said, "You'll brief the next drainage op." Then, already turning toward his tablet, added, "Command wants your slope logic baked into the forecast grid." She said, "Copy," and kept walking. Down near the edge of the outer ditch, a collapsed section of barrier had been cleared by a small crew. One of them worked in silence, studying how the water had curved around the trench Dana had built. He knelt and dragged his fingers through the gravel she had packed beneath the upper tarp edge. When he stood, he dusted his hands and looked over at her. He gave a nod, nothing more. She returned it and moved on. At the perimeter, She folded the last tarp and cinched it with paracord. The sun had already dried the edge into a stiff shell. As she knelt to lift it, a breeze picked up, carrying the faint smell of salt and engine oil across the yard. Her trench was no longer needed, but it remained, like a shape burned into memory. Even the places where the bags had sagged looked deliberate now, held on purpose. Valerie passed by late in the afternoon, walking with a checklist tucked against her hip. She slowed near the generator shed and looked up at Dana. Her mouth opened as if to say something, then didn't. She gave a nod, a quiet one. Dana didn't return it, but she met her eyes. Then she turned and picked up the last bag. By sundown, the field was half cleared. The storage containers had been righted. New cable lines were coiled for replacement. The base was rebuilding itself in quiet, slow loops. One of the junior officers from the uplink team sat by the wall, radio balanced on his knee. He looked out over the trench as if trying to map it in memory. He didn't speak. He just watched. The original trench line was still visible from above. Someone had left a marker flag at the center point. It wasn't official, and it didn't carry a label, but no one removed it. At the edge of her work site, Dana sat for a moment on a split crate, her hands resting in her lap. Her posture was upright, her breathing calm. She didn't smile. She didn't look for anyone to notice. She had never asked to be seen. But they saw her now, and nothing needed to be said. Sometimes the strongest person on base is the one no one sees. Dana didn't lead with rank or voice. She led with steadiness, with a shovel in her hands and a storm in her forecast that no one else believed. They laughed at her, dismissed her, told her she didn't belong. But when the flood came, it was her trench that held. Not because she was loud, not because she needed recognition, but because she was ready. Her strength was not in proving others wrong. It was in knowing what was right and doing it anyway. If her story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Think about the ones around you who stay quiet, who show up, who prepare without praise. Then share your thoughts in the comments or follow for more stories like this about quiet power, earned respect, and the ones who hold the line when no one else can.